Hi, everyone. It's Professor Spears, and welcome to our next episode of Human Services in Northwest Indiana. This is our second episode related to addiction. And as we mentioned in the last episode, if you caught that, this episode is going to be focusing on what we call micro-related factors as it relates to addiction. So this is on a smaller scale from an individual up to a family and small groups. And the next episode will be on macro issues, which is closer to sociological types of influences and institutional structures and the way that laws are constructed and enforced. So very big picture look at it. But in this episode, we're going to be looking at the smaller scale, which is more focused toward psychology rather than a more sociological approach. So I would like to ask my two guests to introduce themselves.
My name is Tracy Trout. I am a licensed therapist in the state of Indiana, and I have a small private practice where I focus primarily on people coming out of the culture of addiction into recovery. And I also do a fair amount of trauma work, and I work a lot with vets and people with PTSD. I also am very fortunate to going on my 14th year of working at the Moraine House. So I provide individual and group services at the Moraine House, which is a sober living facility here in Valpo. And then I also am the program director for the Indiana State Nurses Assistance Program, which is a monitoring program for nurses and pharmacists also who are struggling with mental health and addiction disorders. And thank you for having me here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. And
I am Katie Moore. Right now, I am a recent graduate from Southern New Hampshire University. I got my bachelor's in psychology with a concentration in mental health and addictions. I am a certified peer recovery coach. I work a lot in treatment settings on a mobile response team as well. But most of all, I'm a recovering addict. I'll have 4 years tomorrow, actually. So super exciting. But yeah, I'm just super grateful to be here.
great, thank you. And if you saw the last episode, you know that these are the two wonderful guests that I had last time, and it was very well received. And within a week, we had as many or more viewers than any other episode had, and it's gone way beyond that now. So you guys are a big hit.
That's good.
Yes, you did very well.
We'll start going on the road.
There you go.
3 of us will go on a little circuit. Mhm.
Okay, well, my first question that I would like to ask is the relationship between trauma and substance use disorder. There's a lot of research and anecdotal stories and evidence that support the relationship between the two, that there's a correlation. People who experience significant trauma early in life have a much higher risk of developing a substance use disorder. And I was wondering if the two of you could tell us a little bit of your thoughts and experiences with that. And then I'll ask about, after we finish, I'll ask about exceptions, people who've not gone through that. So whoever would like to go first.
Yeah, I think I know for me personally, trauma was really like the gateway into my active addiction. And I think there is a huge link when it comes to like childhood trauma, when you look at like ACEs and things like that, that like, you know, early childhood and even like early adolescent trauma is something.
Can you define ACEs for our audience?
ACEs, it's adverse childhood experiences. So basically it's like a scaling and it rates you. It'll like ask questions of like, have your, you know, parents been through a divorce, I think is one. Is there, you know, and it just relates to like childhood trauma that you go through. So if you rate higher on the ACEs scale, then you are more susceptible to, I think, substance use or like any mental health issues or, you know,
Certain diseases like heart
Heart
disease,
disease,
stomach
yeah.
issues, those
Mhm.
kinds of things.
so it goes into, so I think statistically you are at greater risk if you do experience any like childhood trauma or anything like that. And I know for me personally, it was that way. I experienced a lot of trauma in early adolescence, and then through my adolescence, it was just like re-traumatized experiences and stuff. But I think with that, it's not only does trauma lead to addiction in a lot of cases, but also addiction leads to trauma too. So even if somebody does not experience trauma before substance use comes into play, during substance use, trauma then can become into play. So it's kind of sometimes what came first, the chicken or the egg, but in most cases it does. A lot of times people want to associate like substance use and active addiction and things like that with trauma and or with the gateway being like weed and alcohol and things like that. And in reality, I know in my experience and a lot of people's experience, like the gateway is trauma, in my opinion.
And you brought up an interesting notion about the trauma that can be, it can and probably very, very often is a result of the addiction.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, a lot of times, like, it's not just about the drugs or the substances, it's about the lifestyle. And a lot of times that lifestyle includes the violence. It can include things like gang activity, it can include gun violence, it can, you know, include a lot of things. Or also you get into like sexual assault rates when it comes to substances and theft and generational trauma. And like there's so many things that go into during active addiction that can happen. So somebody who, you know, even at parties, right? You hear of things like, you know, drinking got out of control and a fight broke out, or drinking got out of control and sexual assault, you know, and like all these things that, you know, somebody may not start with trauma, but like through active addiction, trauma does come, you know, whether that's the lifestyle. I know there's a lot with gun violence. There's a lot with gang violence. There's a lot of trauma that just comes inherently, I think, sometimes with the lifestyle of active addiction. So not necessarily substance use itself, but also the lifestyle that comes with substance use. Mhm.
As you were talking, it reminded me of a case probably 5 or 6 years ago of a teenage girl who was at a drinking party and somebody slipped her something and she was unconscious and people recorded it and
Mhm.
posted it on the internet. You remember the
Yes,
case?
I do.
And one of the perpetrators was a star football player,
Mhm.
and it was a small town where football was everything.
Mhm.
And they tried to cover up and blame the girl.
Mhm.
And they showed, people holding her hand and feet and carrying her limp body from one room to the next.
Yes.
So, I mean, that is a very stark example of the kind of thing I
Mhm.
think that you were talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One of the things we do know now with a lot of brain imaging is that where addiction hits in the brain is in the limbic system. So I should have brought my mitten today, but I'll use my hand. So the brain kind of sits like this, right, with our two hemispheres.
Mm.
And so what is affected in when you are using things or you have a substance use disorder is with that limbic system, which is if you were unfold the brain, the limbic system is like right here on my thumb. So if you close back up, it's way deep in there. We call it like our reptilian brain or and that directly because the nucleus accumbens is in there. So if you take opiate use, when you inject or take an opiate for any of us, whether it's just we're taking it for pain or we're actually taking it because we want to be high, that goes in, it locks down that receptor site. The sodium channel is closed and a flood of dopamine is already in that synaptic cleft, which is what makes people sort of nod out because you've got this sort of very big euphoric experience. But because the channel is locked, it's like a lock and a key, because that receptor is locked, there's no reuptake of the dopamine. And so the nucleus accumbens is like I can't suck it back up. So you get this euphoric feeling. So the limbic system then also is where trauma happens. It's where it's very close to the amygdala, the hippocampus, and where we turn on that fight or flight switch. And so you kind of got a combo platter with people already having their limbic system hyperactivated with trauma prior to going into that. And then further, the limbic system gets activated because we've got a substance coming in there. So whatever substance we're using, whether it's alcohol, it's weed, it's what drugs, it's anything, that area of the brain, this limbic system, is going to be hyper stimulated. Once that becomes hyper stimulated, whether it's trauma or it's a combination, that fight or flight is very hard to go down. And the difference between your cortex thinking and the limbic system, just to explain, is in the limbic system, it's black, white. It's either scary or it's safe. It's either angry or I'm not. It's all emotional, right? It's the system that'll also kick off like I'm about to get run over or whatever, right? Where in the cortex, that's our critical thinking. So what happens is you spend so much time with trauma or with trauma and addiction in your limbic system, and everything becomes an emotional reaction, right? Or a way in which to minimize what you're feeling. So if you use, you're going to tamp all that system down. So that's sort of the scientific thing that's happening.
Mhm.
And so one of the things they're doing in trauma-informed care now, and we should be doing in all treatment, is teaching people about A, what's happened to their brain, and B, how you can start to recognize in yourself how you're reacting from your limbic side instead of your cortex.
And it would seem that it would be very valuable if we
Mhm.
could get family members to
Correct.
recognize
Correct.
that,
Correct.
because it gets so oversimplified
Mhm.
that it's just a choice.
Mhm.
But when the structure of your brain is actually changed,
Mhm.
you lose a lot of that ability to make rational choices. So,
And you also lose the ability to manufacture any neurotransmitters on your own, right? Your ability, if you've abused opiates long enough, your ability to manufacture dopamine and some of those other things that make us feel good are greatly diminished because the nucleus accumbens has been trained that the opiate goes in, then I release. I'm not going to release the dopamine I would normally release from laughing or getting a hug or eating a good meal because it doesn't have the trigger. Now there's some there, it's just not a lot. And
Right.
so all of that becomes reduced and you're very emotionally labile because you don't have a way to feel good unless that goes in.
And from some of the research that I've read, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, is when the brain gets changed because of both or either trauma or substance use,
Mhm.
that can be passed on to the next generation.
Yeah, there's some of that because we talk a lot about generational trauma. And I'm not a big, I'll be honest, I'm not a big person on the thing of every substance abuser has some gene. The research is still mixed on that, and I'll just be honest about that. But
Yeah.
what I do know about trauma and how that carries down is that if you have a parent or a caregiver that has been traumatized themselves, the way they emotionally react, the way they handle anger, the way they deal out punishment, the way they seek closeness or affection is going to be dramatically affected, which is then going to change that brain. The woman who wrote the ACEs questionnaire, she also wrote a book, and her name is Nadine. I'll think of her last name in a minute. But one of the examples she gives is our system is trained to go off if you're in the woods and you see a bear.
Right.
Our system is done to give us a bunch of adrenaline so we can run, we can get out of there, we can take care of yourself. And she said, the problem is what happens when you live with the bear? Where are you going to go? So that system is always on, right? And so you're learning within that environment, you're training your brain that you always have to be scanning the room. If you've ever watched people who have a lot of trauma, they will walk into a room of people and they'll be with a group of friends and then they'll leave and the conversation at the end will go something like this. So-and-so is a little off. And everybody else is like, what are you talking about? And then you say, well, no, I saw this, I saw that. They didn't see that because their brains are not trained to constantly look for safety.
So other people's baseline of
Mhm.
uh, being triggered at or activity
Mhm.
is here, and somebody who's experienced a lot of trauma, their regular baseline is going to be up
Right,
here.
right. They're not going to come down and they got very good at, and I know I've had this experience myself. You get really good at, nobody really knows what you're thinking or feeling on the inside, and you're kind of scanning the room and looking for, and sometimes you're not ever all the way comfortable because it takes a while to understand, for your brain to understand that, hey, and those are the little tricks when you have to do that. You really have to ground yourself. Like my feet are on the floor, I'm breathing, I can smell things. And when you tell people to do those kinds of things, they look at you like, yeah, that's going to not help. And I used to think the same thing. Once you do it, it works.
Yes.
But that's generationally how we do it, because a caregiver has a lot of trauma and they're raising these kids and they're impacting their brain development and how that goes forward. And so we just keep repeating the cycle.
Mhm.
So,
Makes good sense to me.
mhm.
What have the two of you found to be the most effective types of treatment modalities when it comes to addiction? And I know that in general therapy, I'm asking an impossible question because people respond to different things, but have you found that when you're treating somebody, a particular approach tends to be more effective than others?
Well, for me, what I would say just in my own experience, because, I'm sort of what I always say, I'm on the outside of the circle. And I am very grateful for my ability to work within the recovery community, because as I always say, I may not be recovering from that, but I'm recovering from other things, right? But what I know from my corner of the world, especially if you are somebody that has never experienced that one of the things you need to do is you need to listen to your clients. You need to listen to you learn all this stuff in grad school and you memorize all the theories and everything else. And then you got to get out of school and you have to deal with people. So you have to listen to your clients and their experiences and how they're thinking and feeling. And are there some common denominators? Sure, of how people are going to react to you. Also, if you are a treatment provider, you better make sure that you are being 100% constantly honest with every client you are interacting with. Because if you are even hesitating on the way you're going to deliver information, you have just lost the trust, because they already feel judged. They already feel like you think they're less than. No matter how many times you say, I don't see you that way, that has to be proven. And so I think that we have a lot of modalities that help, and I'll let Katie jump in on this. I mean, CBT is amazing, DBT is amazing, grounding techniques, but you also have somebody that has they have disconnected from self. And so we're really worried about them putting down the substances and connecting back with their family and going to work and, blah, blah, blah. And then when somebody relapses, you'll hear them say, well, I disappointed, blah, blah, blah. You never hear them say, I let myself down, because we totally take the self out of this. You got to put the self back in, because in order for them to heal, they got to plug back in here before we can plug them back into all these other things. So I think the work on, and it's not just self-esteem, it is seeing themselves. One of the things I say is I have a chronic relapsing condition. I have rheumatoid arthritis, but I don't get ousted from parties because I have RA, right?
Yeah.
That people are like, oh God, you're going to end up in a wheelchair. That's kind of what you get. But, that's part of the problem. If we could normalize all of this and just say, this is a chronic relapsing condition, and this is the medicine or the work that people in recovery are doing, is going to meetings, is staying connected with other people in recovery, is doing whatever it is for them, right? Not for somebody else. And so I have seen that work really effectively, but it is connection.
It is.
Connection, connection, connection. Connection and safety, I think, are two of the most important things that you have to get them to feel and to understand is there, and to understand that is tenuous, because you can go from this environment to this environment and you're not going to have that connection and safety. That's okay, right? But everything's sort of got to normalize. So I'll let you kind of jump in and.
Yeah, I think a huge part to like what you said is that, you have somebody who has all these feelings in their bodies of like hopelessness, of loneliness, and are using substances to fill that. So then when you take the substance away, that void is still left in there. And so the idea that, somehow you're going to take the substance use out and then they can reconnect to all these other things in their lives and like, oh, family back, work back, let me get into that again. That a lot of times that void is still there, that eventually due to this being like a relapsing condition, that void just sitting there with nothing else to fill inside of it, it's going to end up where, higher risk of like depression rates and things like that, because there is nothing else to fill. When recovery, I think the best way to do it is through connection, no matter what that way is, because there's so many different pathways of recovery, whether it's 12-step programs, whether it's art programs, religion, like there's so many recovery pathways that it's not a one size fit all. So when you look at somebody who's like early in recovery or just getting off of substances and you throw a 12-step meeting at them, that's not always going to be received well. You know, oh, I'm going to go into a room with a bunch of other people, you know, I'm better, I'm worse, all these different feelings. But wherever they can find that connection, that sort of like camaraderie with another human being, where automatically when they go in and meet them and there isn't going to be that judgment because it is somebody who has experienced it before, or somebody who isn't judging them, somebody who can relate, or like at the end of the day, somebody who can like just provide an ear to them.
And
like
hold the
love.
space. And hold the
Exactly.
space without making a weird face because you just said that you lived in it, somebody lived in a trap house and they're eating out of dumpsters, right?
Mhm.
Those are not things that I want to hear. But I also know that with certain clients, I'm going to hear those things and they're sad and they're tragic. But what I always say is, I always say, my God, what strength you have, what resilience you have. And they look at me like I'm insane. How can you say that? And I'm like, well, you survived living in a trap house and eating out of dumpsters and, you know, yucky food, and you're still breathing and you have no
Not
infection.
everybody could have
Not
done
everybody
that.
could. And I always say there, I would not survive,
Yeah.
would not survive. And that's why, and it's also thinking, because their thinking is so skewed right now that they are the worst person on the planet, that they are never going to get anything back, that, you know, they're never going to outrun this, right? And then we got some people have some criminal justice, and we'll talk about that later, but you really need to work on, that's where that CBT and that DBT comes in handy because you're working on the thinking, right?
Mhm.
Because you got to move them into the thinking. And then also, I think you have to teach them about when that panic comes, when that little voice comes up and tells you this is a great idea, that you got to ground yourself. You know, there's the saying in the 12-step community, first thought wrong, right? And I've heard a lot of sponsors say first thought wrong, and probably the next 5 are going to be wrong too,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So it's also teaching them that it's okay and it's safe to reach out to people, right? Because a lot of people will tell you in the moment of relapse, I didn't I'm not reaching out to anyone, right?
Mhm.
I'm not going to reach out. I can't do that because there's all this failure, whatever's happening. So it's really working on that thinking and bringing them back to themselves. And I'm also just going to call it out, constantly handing people who have left the cultural addiction and come into the culture of recovery worksheets on their triggers, on what's your trigger. I've had people tell me, yeah, you know, my trigger is it was 80 degrees and sunny outside. It was a great day. So I used.
I woke up, I put my feet on the floor. That was the trigger.
That was my trigger.
Absolutely.
So we spend a lot of time on what are your triggers and what are you feeling and what do you whatever. They don't know. If they knew, they would fix it themselves. So also staying away from certain questions that people can't answer. Well, how did you feel about your opiate use? Like, sorry. Yeah, what are you supposed to say to that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So doing all these worksheets and, you know, yes, is writing important and helpful to a lot of people in recovery? Yes. And a lot of
Mhm.
other people don't want to do it because it's going to be misspelled. It's not going to sound great. Like we did a Gestalt exercise in my group last night, and one of the guys said to me, I can't read this out loud. And he said, would you read it for me? And he handed me his paper. I said, sure. I'm not going to humiliate you. I'm not going to embarrass you. There could be a million reasons why you didn't want to read that. Maybe you can't read well.
Mhm.
Pardon me. So but in that, if you're in a certain group, somebody might really get mad. You're not participating.
Absolutely. And I think an important thing, like through all the different recovery pathways, I think that one of the most successful things, no matter what it is just that relationship with other people, that relationship to myself, that relationship to my family, that
Mhm.
relationship to my friends. And at the end of the day, like what community am I surrounded by? You know, whether that's a recovery community of a 12-step program, recovery community of churches, of art groups, of music groups, anything like that. It's just rebuilding relationships. And I think with that comes like learning how to communicate, learning how to reach out, learning that vulnerability that happens within relationships and
Mhm.
different dynamics and stuff that like
Mhm.
through connection and relationships, no matter what that looks like in any pathway, I think that is probably one of the most vital things is being able to like trust, especially if you have somebody who is like new to the recovery community, no matter what that is, coming from a background of distrust, you know, coming from a background of not trusting anybody, coming from a background of trauma,
Mhm.
to walk into a room and just be like, hi, yeah, this is all my things, you know, like that's
Right. Because it's a safety
It
issue.
is.
It's it's not, sometimes it is a physical safety issue, but it's also an emotional safety issue,
Absolutely.
right? Because you don't know who you can trust. You don't know if you can even trust yourself.
Mhm.
And also I've noticed, and you can give me some more feedback on this. One of the things I hear a lot from my clients is, well, I had this friend or this person I know, and we're having this really, and the person relapses. And here sits this person in recovery feeling guilty because they've had to cut them off or set some kind of boundary.
Mhm.
And the question always is, well, I know what this feels like. I've done worse, right? Or I've done da-da, and now I'm letting that person go. And what I always say is right here, right now, you are in the culture of recovery. And in the culture of recovery, you have the right to say who gets a seat at your table and who doesn't. And I said, and sometimes boundary setting is the best thing we can do for people.
Mhm.
I love you. I hope you're going to be okay. I care about you. Give me a jingle when you're ready to go to treatment and I'll help you.
Mhm.
But right now, your sobriety has to matter more than whatever hurt feelings you're having because you feel like you're not supporting, because that's a big part of the 12-step community, right?
It
Is
absolutely is.
supporting everybody, and then they feel judgmental. And I
Mhm.
think those are complicated feelings.
It is. They're very complex, especially when, it's like, these are my people. This is my community. And, I got out and now they're back. And why is it fair that I am doing this and they're not,
Mhm.
And I think it's the idea that like, because I've experienced this with friends and with loved ones and their sponsees and things like that, where it's like, I will love you, but I'm not going to love you to your death.
Mhm.
I love you. I'm not going to love you to death, and that is setting boundaries, because at some point it's like, I can't save you. That's not what this is. This isn't about me saving you. This isn't about me dragging you through this process, but the seed is planted.
Mhm.
And now it is up to them on whether they find their way back. And I think something to note too is like preventing somebody else from hitting a bottom. If I'm dragging somebody through recovery who does not want this, who isn't interested in this, who wants to leave this, like I cannot save them. I cannot force them to be in a program. I cannot force them to participate in recovery. That like at the end of the day, like if I do that and then they relapse, the guilt in me would be far higher than if I just let them know I love you, I support you, and I will be here for you. Give me a call when you're ready.
Yep.
That's it.
Mhm. Sort of like the theory of why we don't help chicks out of eggs, right? A chick that's been helped out of an egg is going to eventually die. They're just not strong enough, right? Because there's something about that battle of poking yourself out, right? And it's the same thing, but it's really, I just think it's really hard to have a shared experience and then have to look at somebody and say, unless you're ready to be clean and sober or go to treatment, whatever it is, I have to back up.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Absolutely. There's the whole idea of like being in a boat. I'm in the middle of a boat and this person's hanging on to the edge of the boat,
Mhm.
and if I'm going to the edge of the boat to try helping them in while they're pulling down, we're both falling over.
Mhm.
We're both going to fall over. Whether I stay in the middle of the boat and support you to get yourself into the middle of the boat
Right.
too, that's going to be more successful than me trying to drag you on top of this
Right,
boat
but
without
that,
falling.
your
Oh,
analogy is
good
beautiful.
analogy,
Because
yeah.
they have to reach up, right?
Mhm.
So they got to let go and stop pulling down. And if they reach up and you can pull them into the boat.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
I will unconditionally love them, whether they are using or not, but I also love myself enough where
Correct.
I'm not going to put myself into that situation, and be
Mhm.
right back into it too.
And there should be no guilt in loving yourself that
Absolutely.
much, ever,
Absolutely.
ever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like in spite of the technique-based theoretical perspectives, what needs to be present in addition is like Carl Rogers'
Oh,
unconditional
yes.
positive regard
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
the value,
Yep.
I love
Mhm.
you, but I don't love some of the
Mhm.
things that have happened.
Mhm.
And I value you as the person that you are.
Mhm. And it has to be multifaceted.
Yes.
It can't just be therapy
Mhm.
or just celebrate recovery or smart recovery or just the 12 steps, right? It's got to be multifaceted because I think that anything would get boring after a while, right? Even if you're working out, you're changing machines all the time, right?
Mhm.
You're not just sitting on the leg machine or the ab machine or whatever. I think, but we don't give them the freedom to do that,
Mm-mm.
right?
Mhm.
We sort of pigeonhole it. And there's a multifaceted approach.
Absolutely, especially if like addiction came from different social factors and
Correct.
things like that, that if there is trauma there, the 12 steps, really covers addiction. It's not going to cover PTSD,
Mm-mm.
so it's like making sure that there could be like individual therapy in place that is able to address those things.
Right.
I always say that, like, I got clean and I thought life was going to be perfect.
Mhm.
Life is going to be great now. I am clean. Everything's good. And then it was like, oh, I still have trauma, you know? Oh, I'm
Oh,
still dealing with the PTSD.
right.
Like, what am I supposed to do with that?
Mhm.
I'm clean now. I thought
Mhm.
everything was going to be
But
fine.
isn't that that's the message we send, right?
Mhm.
That's what we tell everybody. If you just put down the drugs, if you just put down the booze, if you just put down the gambling, come on over here, man. It's going to be great. We leave out the whole, like, you got to reconstruct your thoughts and your feelings. You got to restructure your whole world. That part is not shared.
No, your emotions are going to be
All
all
over the place. Yes. You're going to have weird dreams. You're not going to be sleeping, or you're
Mhm.
going to be sleeping too. Yes. And then we also want to take people coming into the culture of recovery and be like, oh, here's a bag full of drugs that we're going to let you legally take now. Right.
Right?
We don't want you to take those over here, but we're going to, and their systems have not had a moment to unwind from everything they were putting in their systems. Now, obviously, if somebody's got huge bipolar symptoms, something else, but I could also argue that when someone is detoxing and they're going through that first month, we don't really know what's happening.
Yeah.
Is it the detox and the moving into recovery, or is there really something underlying? So we need to give them time to settle.
Because the chemicals are just going all
Mhm.
over the
Right.
place.
The amount of like misdiagnosis of bipolar disorder in
It's
people who
huge.
are newly clean,
Huge,
huge, unbelievably huge. They get clean, they get the substances out of their system, they start feeling some emotions, and they're, the first step, because
Mhm.
what society trains us to do is like, I'm not feeling okay, all these things are wrong, let me go to a doctor and see.
Mhm.
And then doctor's like, oh, here's all your wild emotions, bipolar,
Mhm.
and then they get severely misdiagnosed.
And they're on some heavy drugs.
Heavy.
Or, I have a client right now who said to me the other day, I think I have cancer. I was like, okay. But really, what we're trying to avoid doing, is we're trying to find everything else that's wrong, except for the problem of the alcohol. Mhm.
Mhm.
And we're also people are trying to diagnose with the bipolar, put other medications in there, which shouldn't be even in there to begin with for drinking. So it's all some of the things you feel physically are a reaction to the withholding of the substance, right?
Mhm.
And it getting out of your system, or the fact that you still need it, you still want it.
Absolutely. Even looking at like pause, like the withdrawals, sometimes people think that like it's this physical withdrawal that you'll last, 4 to 7 days. I'm going to withdraw for 4 to 7 days and then I'm going to be good. And, mentally, physically, I'll be perfectly fine.
Mhm.
Not recognizing that like withdrawal symptoms will last.
18 months.
Yes.
24 months.
Mhm.
Mhm.
They will last a long time,
Mhm.
emotional effects, physical effects, all of that. Like the withdrawal is not just a 4-day period where, with like opiate addiction, where it's like the throwing up, the sweat, all of it, it
Mhm.
will last for months and months and months. So with that still going on in their system, and then they get prescribed with a bipolar medication, those on top of each other.
And for our audience, pause is post-acute withdrawal syndrome.
Yes.
So, and I think that gets overlooked a lot. I think post-acute withdrawal syndrome gets minimized a lot for a lot of people that are coming into recovery.
Mhm.
Some people have a lot of it, some people don't, but I also think it's not a thing that a lot of people in early recovery even talk about.
Absolutely.
Because I think if they talk about that, they feel like then people are going to think they want to use.
Mhm.
I think sometimes people get caught up in this shame, like being in early recovery and like getting through withdrawals and then being like, I'm not supposed to think about drugs anymore. It's like, oh no, you can think about drugs for the rest of your life. If
Mhm.
like this is that somehow like talking about your feelings or admitting that like, yeah, I want to go get high, is somehow supposed to be faced with like punishment and shame and guilt.
Mhm.
And it's the same people, I think, sometimes that are pushing that shame and guilt and things that are the reasons why they're continued use in the first place or barriers to treatment in the first place.
Mhm.
So it's like this double-edged sword. So it's like, okay, do you want me to get clean and be in recovery? But then if I admit that I want to use, then somehow I'm still facing shame and punishment, you know? Then it's like, where are they supposed to go? What are they supposed to
Well,
do?
right. And it felt better if I was still going to feel all this. It felt better when I had access to my coping mechanism,
Yeah.
right? Addiction is a maladaptive coping mechanism.
Mhm.
It
Right.
truly is, right? Too much cell phone use, maladaptive coping mechanism, right? Online shopping, maladaptive coping mechanism,
Yeah.
gambling, food, avoiding emotional conversation or emotional attachment, maladaptive coping mechanism, right?
Mm,
We've got a lot of them. I wish they would just take addictive disorders and put them in the same pile so we could just look at them evenly.
mhm.
Absolutely.
And that would
Absolutely.
help a lot of
Mhm.
lay people if they became educated.
Mhm.
Because I think what, to both of your points, I think people who don't know any better,
Mhm.
they view detox like it's a switch.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Okay, they've gone through this, they're not throwing up, they're not shaking, they're
Mhm.
not having hallucinations.
Mhm.
Now they're all clean and the problem solved.
Correct.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Reset button has been done, like, right? That's what
Yeah.
they think, like we rebooted their system. Bang, you're ready to go.
Yep. That's like some ideas of treatment.
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. It's like you
Right.
get into treatment, you go through the, detox process, you go to, 2 weeks of residential, and then you get out, everything is perfect.
Mhm.
Never gonna think about drugs or alcohol ever again,
Correct.
you know?
Mhm. And most people who go to inpatient treatment are basically only, if they got insurance coverage, it's only going to be 30, 45 days.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's not a lot of time.
No.
And then they'll suggest you go on to IOP, and that's usually about 12 to 14 weeks. That
Mhm.
can be good. It can be not good. Just depends.
Intensive
Yes, the
outpatient.
program. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. So, and then, there's aftercare, which a lot of people do, a lot of people don't. But again, while they're in that treatment thing, the other thing I don't think we're doing is doing a good job of connecting them because they're not going to be in treatment forever. That's 30 to 45 days. So when you send them out with that discharge plan, what's on that discharge plan? Have you given them the website to find AA and NA meetings?
Mhm.
Have you told them about Smart Recovery and that can be found online? Have you offered up books or, any kind of residual things? Have you given them a list of therapists or for perhaps things like the group you run, right?
Mhm.
Like that would be open. You could go in there. A lot of people who come into the culture of recovery are depressed, right?
Right?
But you're not going to talk about that necessarily at a 12-step meeting unless, like I hear from my guys at the Marine House, it's an overshare. But those kinds of things, knowing those kinds of things as a provider and where to go and where to let people try things.
Mhm.
But instead, it's like courts will always say 90 meetings in 90 days.
Mhm.
Okay, what are we doing with that? Right?
Mhm.
I'm not saying I don't think meetings are important. I do. But I will also tell you that what I've heard, and you can verify or not verify this, is that it takes a while to find your meetings. It takes
Yes.
a while to kind of find your tribe within that, right? Because different meetings have different vibes. Different
Sure.
meetings are about different things,
Different
right?
topics, people.
Exactly.
Literature meetings,
Right.
all sorts.
We're just reading the book. It takes a while to find your tribe and your rhythm. But we expect that they walk out of the door of treatment, they are to have it in the bag and all that done, and nobody has helped you. We talked about wraparound.
Absolutely.
There needs to be wraparound
Mhm. I think
and follow up.
exactly. And a little bit more warmer handoff to
Oh,
it.
yeah.
A lot of times it's the discharge paper and it's like, all right, there's meetings in your area. Go find them.
Mhm.
And it's like, okay, these people might be in treatment for the first time and have no idea what even a 12-step meeting is.
Right.
Have no idea that this isn't even like accessible in their area.
Mhm.
Sending them a link, they're not going to know what an open versus a closed meeting is. They're not going to know what a literature, they're not going to know any of these things, or even the idea of like, yeah, there's this church down the street, go. To
Mhm.
even let them know what door to walk into, where to
Mhm.
go in the facility,
Correct.
anything like that. Like those are important things that like I think treatment providers need to provide,
Mhm.
because just the idea that they're in treatment and if you just give them some information, they're going to follow up on them.
Mhm.
Know that anxiety that they're feeling because this is their first time in their life that they're experiencing life,
Mhm.
not having to survive, but being able to live.
Mhm.
Walking into a grocery store is going to be hard for them.
Well, of course it is. right?
Mhm.
You know, and things like you can call, every area has a central office for like AANA. So for example, the central office up here, I believe is in Hammond.
Mhm.
And you can call them. And if you are in the program and you're in recovery, they have a group of people who volunteer to do things like if you need to get to the doctor, you can arrange and the central office will help you arrange getting a ride to the doctor or a ride to court. Or you know, I've called there before and asked, you know, can I have a PDF of like, sometimes they have literature that's
Yeah,
got the meetings or whatever,
absolutely.
or if I make a donation, can I, you know, get the information so I can have it for my clients? They will give you anything. So as a
Mhm.
provider, there are many ways out there for you to have that and explain those very things, right?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Even the idea, like if you call on any of the pamphlets of like a 12-step meeting, you know, like an NA or anything like that, like somebody will answer that phone 24/7,
Mhm.
no matter what time of day. It's
Mhm.
somebody who is designated to have that phone and they answer the phone. There's people that transportation is a huge issue.
Mhm.
They call the line, somebody will be able to like connect through other recovery members throughout the community.
And somebody will even drive you to treatment.
They will.
At 3 o'clock in the morning, they will find you somebody. People in the recovery community are some of the most generous people.
Absolutely.
And people in long-term recovery are the most self-accountable people I have ever met in my life.
Mhm.
Because some problem will arise and they'll be like, well, you know, they're always really good at looking at the other side of it. Like, what's
Mhm.
my role, right? Whereas the rest of us are like, no, this person, whatever. And most 99.9% of the time, somebody in recovery would be like, well, I should have doot. It's not excusing what the other side
Yeah.
did, but they're very good about not overreacting. It's not like they don't have emotions or they don't feel angry or frustrated or sad or tired. They've got all of those.
Mhm.
They're just way better at regulating it than some of us are.
And it's about keeping my side of the street clean,
Correct.
you know? That it's
Mhm.
like, you know, me and you may have something that happened, we both emotions, anything like that, but where's my part in it? How can I clean up my side of the street?
Mhm.
Because I cannot take responsibility for your actions, but I can take responsibility for my actions. If I clean up my side of the street, people are, you know, amends comes into play,
Mhm.
you know, things like that, accountability in general. You know, it's like, okay, let me look at my part. Where did I go wrong? What can I work on? Clean my side of the street up and we move along.
Now,
Mhm.
in talking about um, people assisting, and it involves much more than the person who's in recovery, that leads me to a question about families.
Mhm.
And when somebody, you know, even though they're maybe lucky around here to get the 30 or 45
Mhm.
days, what should a family be doing while their loved one is in inpatient in order to increase the probability of long-term success?
Right. So I'll take this from the treatment side and you can
Okay.
go from the personal side.
Mhm.
Okay. So from my area side of this equation, families need to be educated. And I'm talking broad psychoeducation about the effects physiologically, the effects on the brain. You know, they need to understand exactly what you just said. Like, we went to detox, now we're done, right? You put it down, now we're done. They need to and to the best of their ability, it needs to be explained on a layman's level so they understand. Because I have found that normal helping behaviors are not helpful. It's like families are, don't want you to die, don't want you to die. Let me just reassure everyone. People who are actively using are in the throes of addiction know that that is a potential. They are not immune to this. They know and they don't care. And I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I mean that in they've made their peace with it, right? They know this is a potential, they know whatever they know. So when we keep saying we don't want you to die, they already know that too. They know we don't want them to die. That is not going to get them to stop. That is not going to get them to go, right? It's the strong boundaries. But families need to be educated and they need to sort of be willing to like listen and shed off all these myths that they've been fed, that addiction's a choice, that you just put it down and walk away, that, you know, blah, blah, blah. They need to be educated and they also need to understand that they need to look at what their role was in that. And that is a really hard thing, right? They also need to understand that they do not need to manage the new person in recovery, right? You do not need to manage their recovery. They will manage it. We need to talk, right? That's another thing a lot of people aren't good at. We're not going to have the hard conversations, you know. I have a guy that's moving out, it's in the Marine house and he's going to go back home. And I said, and what conversations have you had with your parents? What? I said, what are their rules? What are their expectations? How are you going to meet those? What happens if you relapse? Have you guys talked about all this? So he went off and he had the conversation. But this isn't his first rodeo either. So I think they're a little accustomed, but we need to talk about that. If you're coming back home, once you get out of rehab, what's going to happen? And constantly going, are you high? Are you drunk? Are you
Mhm.
high? That's what happens,
It does.
right? They're
Mhm.
tired in the morning. All of a sudden it's, you drank 3 cups of coffee. Are you high? We got to talk about this stuff and they need to be in therapy. They need to be using and educated about going to an Al-Anon meeting, going to a Smart Recover Friends and Family, right? And families get very isolated, right? And we deal with this in a bubble because you can talk about the fact that, your kid may have had, diabetes or something, but no one's going to want to hear about your kid's addiction or your husband or your wife or
Right.
whatever. So I think they need to be educated and they need support and direction toward how they can take care of themselves and deal with their own feelings, right? So when that amends process comes,
Mhm.
so oftentimes what happens is the person that's come into recovery has done all the work and the family's sitting over here and they haven't changed anything. And then you have this person that's done all this work trying to integrate with these people who are still stuck back 20 years ago.
Right. And people are creatures of patterns and
Correct.
habits.
Mhm.
And you go back to what was not working before, it's probably not going to work again.
Correct.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I think a big part of it is the education, like you said, but with that comes like support and love
Mhm.
and the idea that like this is a lifelong process and isn't going to be solved in 30 to 45 days,
Mhm.
and understanding that like, I know for me, like I have my own process, but they also have their process too. I have my own perspective of this. They also have their own perspective too. And like being able to have these like hard and open conversations of not only my addiction, but my recovery is so important through this, because without those conversations about my addiction and the things that I've been through, the things that I did, or what I, all these different things of like, hey, you remember this time? Well, it was actually about this. Like those hard conversations are needed in order for me and anybody, I think, to not feel this like stigma and this shame and this guilt, because a lot of times it was like, I knew that I was an addict. I knew before rehab, during rehab, after, like, there was no doubt about it. I knew
Mhm.
this, but this idea that like what if my family like is disappointed, or like the shame or the guilt, all these things. And I moved when I got out of rehab from California to Indiana. And this idea that like, oh my God, nobody in my family is going to know that I'm an addict. It felt like I was being like shamed into a secret, and even though that might have been my own perception, not reality, like the idea that like I can't have these open conversations, as much as I'm like dying to just be like, look what I've been through, look what I've been through. And sometimes not receiving that, from anybody, like it's this reinforced stigma of myself. It's reinforced stigma from other people that like, you're right, I did do something wrong. And this is something that I should hold shame for. And that prevented me
Forever,
forever.
until you take your last breath.
Exactly. And that prevented me from getting treatment when I continued to use after that. That prevented me from opening up or feeling like comfortable to like be vulnerable with the people who are screaming their support for me when I'm still being shamed into
Mhm.
silence for it.
Mhm.
So I think that is one of the most important things, is like that combination of like education and also just like, tell me that I can talk about this,
Mhm.
give me the space to like talk about this and to like explain that like, yeah, I did drugs. Yeah, I'm an addict, but like, look at all these things in my life that happened. And like,
Mhm.
can we talk about that? Can I have this space to talk about this? Can we address why I am this way?
Mhm.
Instead of this constant, like, let's keep it under the wraps. Let's not tell anybody, because then, we don't want people looking at you that way.
No.
And I'm like,
Mm-mm.
well, you're
Even though
looking at
you
me
already
that
are,
way.
you are looking at me
Exactly.
that way, right?
Mhm.
And you are also, you're quieting my story.
Yep.
You're quieting my experience,
Mhm.
right? Because it makes others uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I sometimes feel like families are so accustomed to the individual when they're in the culture of addiction, and they move into recovery, they have no idea how to relate to that person.
Yep.
Mhm.
So I almost think a lot of those questions of are you high, are you whatever, yes, are out of worry, but they're also out of because they're not seeing the same behaviors, right? And then they don't really know how to relate.
Mhm.
And then we don't talk about it.
Right.
Mhm.
And I think what perhaps is the biggest shame in all of this is that a family member does not recognize the magnitude and the trust and the gift that's
Mhm.
being given by saying, I'm willing to share with you and tell you all kinds of
Right.
horribleness that I've been through.
Mhm.
That's not something that we open up to just anybody about. And that is a huge, in my opinion, expression of love and trust
Correct.
when they do
Correct.
that.
Right. And you have to be quiet and you've got to be able to hold the space, as we call it in our biz. You got to be able to hold the space and really listen. And there's not a lot of questions that need to be asked, in my opinion. I think you have to listen.
Yeah.
That is truly active listening. And your face and your body, you can be emotional, you can express that, but you have to let that family member know they're safe. And you've got to be able to hear it. If you really love somebody, then you need to be willing to share the pain
Yeah.
Absolutely.
and not only be worried about your own pain. I'm sure for a lot of parents, there's a ton of guilt. I mean, parenting in general, in my opinion, is one long continuum of being guilty, right? For one thing or the other. And so I'm sure parents feel guilty. Like, they ask you questions all the time. They'll say to me, well, how did I not know this? Well, they didn't hand out a pamphlet when we came home from the hospital, right?
Right.
And when you know your kid, and a lot of people in the culture of addiction are really good at keeping it all on the same level for a really long time. Like you're always saying, oh, adolescents grades drop. Not always. Oh, they drop out of their activities. Not always, right? A person in active addiction can go for long periods of time without anybody really knowing. They may think something a little off, but they'll blame it on hormones or growing or,
right.
whatever. So you can maintain that for a long time. So I know there's guilt and whatever on both sides, but we got to talk about it.
Absolutely.
And hearing someone's story. Mhm.
And the last question, that's a perfect segue to that. And, me being who I am, I can't just give you a soft pitch, final question. It's just not in me.
Mhm.
But we've been talking about families and how they respond to the person in addiction. How do families contribute to the problem in the first place? And how do you go about, without burying them in the guilt that you were talking about, but helping them to understand the dynamics and the interplay between people?
Mhm.
What are some of the things that they do and how do we help them?
Well, I oftentimes think that there's a re-traumatization via families, albeit it's not intentional. And I think treatment can re-traumatize people coming from the culture of addiction with the shame, the guilt, you're not answering my questions, you're not being cooperative, blah, blah, blah. But I think the ways in which families contribute to it is nobody's educated. So I I have two sons. We have two sons, 30 and 27. And I can tell you that when those kids were coming up through the Valparaiso Community School Corporation, kids like mine were not supposed to be the kids that are identified as problem kids, right? You ask either of my two sons now, and they will tell you that on the randomized drug system of testing, they were never tested. So we look at families will do that. We'll look at certain behaviors or certain characteristics or the way somebody dresses, or if in middle school they have or high school they have a piercing or they have a tattoo or whatever, right? And so we're stigmatizing people all of the time, right? We do this with sexual orientation. We do this with, drugs and alcohol. And so as these kids are raising, if you are sitting there, oh, look at that person, he's like alcoholic and you've got all this stuff, you're teaching them that that's stigma, and if the kids, experimented, that can tamp that down, right? It's our reactions to the everyday world. And that's how we're teaching our kids to bring that up. Also, when we don't deal with our own stuff as parents and we have pass down that generational trauma,
Mhm.
you are handing them a little credit card, like, here you go, I'm gonna give you some more trauma, right? If you don't emotionally regulate yourself or handle things yourself, I believe that also contributes to the problem. Is it 100% for sure? No. But it is part of the problem. It truly is part of the problem. And we don't ever let anybody have a moment to breathe, right?
Right.
So we're not looking at our own actions and how much they're impacting, right? We're just more worried about how are your grades? Where my kid going to college, right? You know, what does it look like in our home? What kind of car do we drive, right? We're worried about all the wrong things. And then the biggest thing I think is we're not connecting with them. Adolescents are difficult.
Mhm.
They're prickly, right? They
Mhm.
want the closeness, but there's a great book that was written, I love you, I hate you, can you take me and my friends to the mall? I think nothing describes adolescence better than that, right?
Right.
And so then we as the adults don't know how to create that closeness, right? And we lose the closeness, right? Our kids are busy, we're not eating family dinner anymore. I have a really good friend who's in recovery who says, downfall of society is we don't eat dinner together anymore. We need to be eating one meal a day together, right? And it sounds like so simple and stupid, but it's really not. It goes back to that connection.
Yeah.
We need to connect with our kids. We need to create an environment where I truly, when I say you can tell me anything, I mean that.
Yep.
So,
Absolutely. I think with that too, it's like the idea that like raising kids is somehow like this checklist
Mhm.
where it's like, okay, you get good grades. Are they in sports? Check yes or no, like all these ideas of like, okay, in order for me to like raise this kid right, then it's like these checkpoints, not
Mhm.
recognizing that like we are much more complex than that. Humans in general are much more complex with that when it goes into like emotional intelligence, especially like in an upbringing, that if anybody's like not getting those kinds of needs met, they can still be getting straight A's. And the world will be like, oh, this adolescent is perfectly fine.
Mhm.
Oh, they're doing good in sports. Everything's perfectly fine. Not recognizing like the little things. And I think that connection with it and just meeting them where they're at.
Mhm.
I think like as an adult, seeing a child or a teenager, it's like I'm still thinking like in my adult brain, like, why won't they do this? When in reality, it's like, oh, they're not fully developed. They're going through so many complex issues, hormones, all these other things of like molding them into who they are going to be when they grow up. It's like being able to meet them like where they are at, I think is so important. And just overall like knowledge of things that come with life, not this idea that like adolescents are immune to addiction, adolescents are immune to serious mental health problems. And it's not just their hormones,
Mhm.
it's not just these little things that they'll grow out of, like these are serious issues that if you don't address when they're younger, like it's only
Mhm.
going to get worse throughout their life.
And behaviors, negative or positive, I mean, especially when we look at negative behaviors, right? And we don't ever ask the reason for the negative behavior
Mhm.
because we move straight into punishment,
Mhm.
Right.
right? And so sometimes if we sat for a minute and we go back at it, not maybe in the heated moment, right? Go back at it. What's really going on here? And with an adolescent, you got to work hard.
Yeah.
Because they're going to be like, leave me alone and I want to go to sleep and whatever. And they can't help it. It's where their brains are at. Right?
Right.
They're cranky.
We're all recovering adolescents, aren't we?
Agreed.
Go.
Agreed. Right. But we don't give them space to truly talk to us.
Absolutely.
And they need to know that they're safe and loved,
Mhm.
that there's a difference between me being unhappy with the behavior, right?
Mhm.
I'm not so much unhappy with you as a human. I'm unhappy with your behavior. But the way we do it is I'm unhappy with you. You are safe. You are loved. All human beings on the planet should know in some places, wherever they're in the world, that they are safe and they are valued and they are loved.
And I think that that is a beautiful place for us to end this episode with the reminder that it's absolutely essential that we separate the behavior from the value of the person. And that goes back to Roger's
Mhm.
unconditional positive regard. It doesn't mean that you approve of everything that they're doing. You are working with them and supporting them to try to help them to live the best life that they can. But you make sure that they're aware of the fact that you see the inherent value of them regardless. So I thank you both for another very interesting and thought-provoking episode. And for those of you who are watching, if you are interested in these sorts of topics, I would encourage you to contact me and look into the Human Services program here. It transfers seamlessly into a Bachelor of Social Work program, Valparaiso University, and all the state universities that have a BSW program. And I hear regularly from those who are administrators of the BSW programs that students who transfer here are every bit and sometimes more prepared than the students who started at the university, because we get you, we're going to get your hands dirty. You know, we do a lot of service learning. I'm a big believer in that. And we teach theory and we teach facilitation of groups. And you're taking a bachelor's degree in psychology, you're not going to learn those things. You're not doing yet. That's graduate school stuff. And I'm very proud of our program, and I encourage you to inquire. So you can email me if you would like at dspears18@ivytech.edu, or you can go to our website at ivytech.edu/human services. Thank you very much.